Hello everyone, welcome subscribers. I need more of those. Welcome followers, delighted to have you back. I'm going to continue with this talk I started 2 days ago about global governance or globalism. Okay, and I explained that there are three pillars upon which they depend, that they have to be eroded or even destroyed: the family, the nation state, and Christianity. I spoke about the family in the previous video, and today I'm going to talk about the erosion, call it what you will, the disappearing away, the withering of the nation state. Okay, so globalism, we explained the difference between globalism and globalization. You don't need to hear that again. Or the Great Reset, or the Agenda 2030, or the Build Back Better. No one talks about that anymore. Didn't quite catch on. The existence of this, you remember from the last video that David Rockefeller referred to himself as the secret cabal. And he says, yes, there is one. I'm part of it and I'm aware of it, in his memoirs in 2003, yes. Okay, so the New World Order, the rules-based order, the international rules-based order, the deep state, the unipolar world. We'll have to find the term for this. I thought of the global finance oligarchy. Okay, and that is how I'm going to refer to it until someone makes comes up with something better. You remember the objectives for this global governance, that to be successful, it had to do away. It had these three goals. They had to work towards this new world that they're trying to reorganize. The old world might have worked, divided into nation states might have worked in the 18th and 19th century. That was fine, but now in the 21st century the world has to be organized differently, and they truly believe that. So they're working towards it. They have been working towards it. It's almost done, but not quite. We're talking, therefore, about a supranational, that is the word I will be using, above national or transnational world order, run by individuals who have not been elected, appointed. They're not accountable to anyone but themselves. The institution of a global elite that seeks to implement a supranational government or governance that will bring to an end the sovereignty, in real terms, really, of the different nation states, the different governments, regardless of whether they are democratic, autocratic, dictatorial, authoritarian, and that the population may be prepared in a herd-like manner, that the population, the more sheep-like, the better, as it were. They don't put it obviously in these terms, but a human population that can be reduced and can be, let's say, manipulated or guided, let's say, at will. We know they have tried it. We know that fear has been tried. and has been very successful beyond their dreams, how the people reacted when fearful. And it's still working now, that fear. They only had to say in the United States, refer something to, perhaps masks will be back, who knows? And people have started wearing masks already. It's still there, and it's something that fascinates me. And I have been reading about that too. This is on a tangent thing. This thing of mass psychosis or mass formation, as it is called today. An old theory, but a lot of people, psychologists, are looking into it a little bit more deeply. It's a fascinating topic. I will have to discuss it with you. And the third pillar being Christianity. All right, so I was hoping that perhaps I will deal with Christianity in this video too, but I have a feeling that I won't quite manage it, so I might have to have a third one. Okay, so we are now in the middle of struggle, right now. Middle of a struggle for global power, and, of course, to put it like this, is something you put like this. It's not something that you're going to hear in the news, in the evening news. That agenda, why not? Because they belong to them. I don't need to explain this to you, but there are only 8 international media organizations actually that control the news, how the news gets to you. But what I have to emphasize at the very beginning is that this agenda is there, and it is a much more ambitious agenda than any other former empire. More ambitious than the Alexander Empire, more ambitious than the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Soviet Empire, the British Empire, and even the American Empire itself. I'll explain a little bit later that this American Empire has moved on to a global one. I'll explain that later. And what we are witnessing is beyond that. An empire that intends, or intended, because a spanner has been thrown into the works, but intends to extend to the furthest point of the globe and the last person on the planet. I say intended because the spanner, as I said, has been thrown into the works. Russia has said niet to this. Not here. They are having to recalibrate. All right, let's move on. You know by now that this war, is not between anymore, as we thought at the beginning, between Russia and Ukraine. We did think that, but very soon we realized that it was between, let's say, the US, NATO, and Russia. We thought it was about Ukraine. Now we know it goes well beyond that, and we also know that Russia is not just fighting the Ukraine, but then we realize that Russia is fighting NATO, perhaps more than that, perhaps this supranational world order. More about this later. Now, so the nation state, the independence, the sovereignty of the nation state is an obstacle for this world order, this world governance. That is the independence of the nation state. People are talking now, especially since this war, about the American empire. I hear it more and more, the American empire. In my opinion, and I put it there for you to consider because I might be totally off, totally wrong on this, but I think that to talk about the American empire is old news, in my opinion. That empire has moved on. It metamorphosed, as it were, into the global finance oligarchy. True, under the pretense that is still the United States, but it goes far beyond just the United States as a country. Since the 1990s, and we are going, and you will see that everything starts, that movement from the United States as a country to the global finance oligarchy, we can begin to see it now looking back. It all goes back to the 1990s. Remember the 1990s? All right. It's all coming back to that. Okay, since the 1990s, the American institutions of government and defense and justice, all those institutions, in my opinion, have been taken over. Taken over by who? To satisfy who? To work for whom? This new world order. This rules-based order, this new way of organizing the world. So when you hear these words, you're hearing words that pretend to be the United States as a country. But they are more than that, and they go beyond that. The country itself, the United States of America, and its people are not benefiting from this. They are not benefiting from this more than we are in Europe. They're in the same position as we are, perhaps worse actually, because they are actually paying with their tax dollars, the finance for the most part by the American citizens' tax dollars. The citizens think that it is for their country and their well-being or their benefit. For the United States of America, I think it's well beyond that now. The country has been taken over. Now, remember Trump? How can you forget? Okay. Well, let me give you an example. He was not a politician then, and was still thinking in these terms of the United States of America as a country. Make America great again, etc. All that. He was thinking in terms of, pre-1990s, as if he were in the 1980s and earlier. Along those lines. In other words, he was thinking in terms of sovereign countries. This is my country, this is your country, that is your country. And I think he failed to realize that there was something above all those other countries that was actually working, and sometimes working perhaps even against the United States. So were the American people. So thinking along those lines, they were still thinking along those lines. So because he was thinking along these lines, he was querying a lot of things. For example, NATO. Why are we paying so much money for NATO? Oh, it's NATO. Yes, but I mean, what is the meaning of NATO now? It was supposed to be a defensive thing against the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union is no longer there, so do we really need to spend so much money on NATO? And how about those European countries? They're not paying their fair share. Why should we pay so much for NATO? You remember all those arguments? You remember the Paris Accord? The environment, this and that, okay, all these great ideas. Well, why should we, the American people, pay for this? No, I'm not paying for this. You know, you do it, Europeans, if you want to, but I'm not going to pay for that. He was thinking in terms of the United States of America as a country, as a sovereign country. Didn't see, as I said, that the forces of power had moved on. All right. So when he was saying all these things, well, you know, why do we need NATO here? Why are we paying all this money for it? You know, people around him were all having heart attack. Oh my goodness. He's thinking, which is the military arm of used to be the United States, is now the global finance oligarchy. And people were saying, well, he's thinking of doing away with NATO. So he was corralled with all these people around him that would say, yes, 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 Mr. President, and then they would do something else or not do what he said. Or he wasn't aware of that, I don't think. So the idea was, don't let him do things, because don't let him sign anything, because who knows? I mean, we have to control his instincts. Okay, so he wanted, for example, the troops back from Syria. Why do we have these troops there? So they had to explain to him, well, look, Mr. A third of the Syrian country, it's being occupied by the United States right now, okay? So they had to explain to him, look, it just happens to be where the oil fields are and so on, but we are there, you know, because keeping the peace, you know, because if we move out, you know, this section of the country will start another war with these others. They would sell it to him. And in any case, after he understood about the oil, I'm sure he did, then, you know, they would say to him, you know, it may not be right, it may not be moral, but it works, you know, wink, wink. So he was not aware, for the most part, of these supranational forces that were trying to stop him in what he was trying to do, as I said, because he still saw things in terms of the independence and the sovereignty of the nation state. Okay. There was a time after the Second World War when you could, to a large extent, call it, in my opinion, the American Empire, in the sense that most of the international organizations that were created after the Second World War were there for the benefit of individual sovereign countries. Resolution of disputes and so on and so forth, avoidance of war and so on. Little by little they were taken over to benefit the interests of the United States. That is, I don't think that is an exaggeration. So it became sort of a more American thing. They would argue, well, we were paying for it. How much do you pay for this? Okay, so they were putting the money, really. But it is, I think, a fact that they were working more in terms of what the interests of the United States were. And if the United States didn't particularly like one aspect of a policy, it would have been very difficult to work against that. Fine. But little by little, a step at a time, and I'm going to show you and give you examples, all those international organizations would become, instead of serving just the United States as a country, for the most part, who, as I said, was paying for them, little by little would be answerable and accountable to this supranational global oligarchy. I'm going to give you a summary of how it happened with some examples in a minute. Let's go back to the 1990s. Under Clinton and Blair in the United Kingdom, and Blair is going to be important because America, the United Kingdom, and then it extends to the rest of Europe. All right. What happens in the 1990s is something essential, extremely important. Under Clinton, the deregulation of banks and financial institutions, trade, etc., etc. Corporations, therefore, I'll try to summarize it, no longer really were accountable, loyal to their own sovereign country. Money, trade, industry began to flow freely all over the world, above the nation state. And in summary, you have that also with China coming into the picture and being accepted in the World Trade Organization. So jobs began to flow out of individual nations and move to China. Why? Because of low wages. The industrialization of Western countries began, etc., etc. It began here in the 1990s, and you all know what happened then. So when I mentioned Trump there, it is because he was still thinking in pre-1990s politics, bringing job back to the United States, etc., etc. At the same time, international organizations, which in theory were there, as I said, to represent all sovereign states, each one of them, settle disputes between nations, etc., became organisms to implement this new world order. They were there no longer to mediate between nations, but to enforce particular policies. No longer to mediate between nations, but to enforce these new rules order. In favor of whom? The United States solely? No. It appeared like that, but the transnational oligarchy. Not only these organizations, but, for example, the EU too, the European Union. The European Union turned in the 1990s again we're talking about the 1990s, from a free trade zone into something else, from the common market, from the European Economic Community, where European states traded freely with one another without tariffs. It was an economic thing. Okay, and it turned then too into a political union, no longer just economic, but now political. There were attempts at a constitution, which, as you know, failed everywhere. In France, they had no need to go into that now. But eventually, instead of a constitution, they changed a few things and they called it something else, the Lisbon Treaty, whatever. Okay. Something approved by themselves. Why is this important? Rather naively, it saw itself as equivalent to Europe at the time. The European Union saw itself as equivalent to the United States at first. A European power. And for a while saw itself as such. And there were moments as late as the 2000s when it could still differ and disagree with the United States as a country. I'm going to show you just with one example what happened in a moment. But soon it would become part of this new world, globalist world financial oligarchy, with hardly any decision-making power on the big items, as it were, you understand. Subject to this oligarchy and practically without any means to oppose it. And recently, when Germany began to doubt about going too far against Russia, and it was soon reminded that you cannot do that, Germany. You are subject to us, finance oligarchy, subjected to us. And Germany said, oh yes, of course, forgot for a moment. Don't forget. The people didn't choose you as Chancellor. We did. We put you there. Remember that. Your fealty is to us. You are part of us. And when the President of France, Macron, started, and wisely for him and for France, to flirt now a little with China, or pretend that he could be a mediator sometimes, or start talking about wanting to be a guest at the BRICS summit, for example. But especially started saying a few good things about China, here and there. Lo and behold, the people of Niger rebel against France, and others may follow or pretend to follow. I am being a little sarcastic here, but I believe that in many African countries, Burkina Faso, Mali and so on, had a genuine revolution. Niger may also well be the case too. I'm going to wait and see what happens in 2 years' time, for example, where we are in 2 years' time. Because, as you know, the coup d'etat leaders, were all trained in the US. That doesn't mean anything. They could have been trained there and turned against them. Yes, but if you look at what they did there and how they were trained and this and that, I have a little bit of a question mark here. But that will be another video. My point here is that I will not be surprised if in 2 years' time France, of course, lost all its economic and political power in Niger, and the US, which has already 1,000 troops there, might be in charge then. I would not be surprised. Not the people of Niger, but the US. My point, I repeat, and I could be, as I said, very, very wrong here, but I will see in a year or 2 years' time. Because I have a strong feeling that France was reminded, as Germany was reminded with Nord Stream 2. France was reminded in no uncertain terms, you will not rebel. You will not draw France away from any of our organizations. We chose you, Macron, remember that. You are there to do our bidding, ours and yours, don't forget it. This is where we are now, but let me give you an indication of where we were not long ago. In the 2010s, something like that. So that you see the metamorphosis from the EU being somewhat still independent of this new order and where we are today, that they have to follow. An example which is not very well known, but I chose it because of that. You heard about it perhaps and didn't pay attention because everything seemed fine and you weren't interested in this. And that is the relationship between the US and the EU. The US already as a global finance oligarchy, and the EU still dealing with the United States, still with a certain amount of independence. And that is before the European Union became obedient and practically supine there. Let's go back to the days when the European Union could still defy, let's say, the US. Obama left office without getting the US and the EU, United States and the European Union, to sign the TTIP accord. What is the TTIP accord? Well, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which was presented as a free trade agreement, but which in reality was going to mean the end of the nation state. We are all in favor of free trade. The free trade is not the difficult part. In fact, many of us think that it is almost criminal that the countries that are not rich are not allowed to sell their products freely to rich countries without lots of tariffs, interference, and so on. While richer countries nevertheless are free to impose on poor countries their technology, their copyrights, their royalties, and so on and so forth. So people in Panama will have to swallow any Hollywood garbage that gets there, but are going to have a big shock when they're trying to sell their cocoa to the United States themselves. If you get cocoa, it will be because an American company is selling it to you. They won't be able to do it easily. That is, of course, unjust. So in this sense, we all agree with free trade. Trade that is free-flowing. Okay, but this treaty, pretending to be about free trade, was not about free trade, and in fact ended up failing because some countries in the European Union got a little bit scared. They could still defy the United States. For example, the treaty intended that there'd be no type of regulation on the large transnational corporations about medicaments, about drugs. Let me say that again. That there would be no type of regulation on large transnational corporations about medicaments, drugs, medicines. All right. Now, take into account that approximately for every 200 drugs that are prohibited in the European Union, only 20 of those are prohibited in the United States. For every 20 prohibited in the United States, there are 200 prohibited by law in the European Union at the time. Obviously, then, you see that there is a different regulation system, the one that is being used. In the US, it's very easy to sell medical drugs. In fact, people are constantly bombarded with commercials about them, every 10 minutes on television practically. And you can buy them easily in supermarkets and so on. What I'm saying is that they're easy, relatively easy to put in the market. Of course, if you have a problem and someone dies, then you will have to face it in court and so on. But you can launch it. You can launch a medical product much, much more easily than in Europe. And you can buy something in America in a supermarket that in Europe you would need a prescription for that. Much more restricted in Europe. And the same happens with food, for example. A good part of the meat that is sold in the United States, from the European Union's point of view, that meat is not suitable for human consumption. They've stated that clearly. So, lots of problems also with artificial food and different regulation systems. And what the treaty wanted to do was to do away with this difference, okay, of regulation, or do away with the regulation. Okay, right. So it wanted to change this disparity, this difference in laws, and more. What the TTIP wanted to establish, that if a dispute occurred between a transnational corporation and a particular country, a particular government of a country, for example, say if the government of France had a problem with a transnational corporation, that the treaty said would not be decided in a court of law, but only through a mediator, a mediation committee. It would be decided by mediation. And you know what? That mediation committee, they actually had the goal to say, would be appointed by the transnational corporation. Wonderful thing, you know? So you and I have a quarrel. I stole your car. You want to take me to court? No, the law says no, no, no. We'll appoint a mediator, and then I, who stole your car, I have to name the mediator, which I shall. My daughter, my husband over there. Okay. In any case, the treaty failed. And as I said, because some European countries still had a say, and they got a little bit scared and nervous about agreeing to it. They still had a little bit of power to decide for themselves, and that was to change. But in this sense, by this time, the idea of ending, a step at a time, the sovereignty of independent states was already quite advanced. International organizations, for example, which had acted as international, were being changed into organizations satisfying this global governance, rather than engaging in disputes between individual countries. they were all being brought back into the globalist fold, as it were, via treaties and accords and regulations. Some of them, international organizations, do serve a purpose, of course. I am not disputing that, but there is a globalist agenda there behind this approach to end sovereign identities and populations by different means, as we saw in the previous video. The planet has approximately 7,300 billion inhabitants at the moment. By the year 2030, around 8,500 billion. By the year 2050, it is estimated that approximately 9,700 billion. And part of this globalist agenda is to reduce the population, and we talked about that in the previous video. Yes, there is no doubt about this. Okay, that is one of their main goals. So, as we saw in the previous video, that you have the promotion of abortion here at one end, preventing babies being born, and euthanasia being more and more encouraged at the other end. Legislation that is very, very much advanced in many countries in Europe already. In other words, for the people who are no longer useful economically. Yes, that's one way. Another way may be war. Don't know if they will continue using it. Perhaps it's too bloody, too visible. That's what I thought for a long time. I thought, but perhaps no longer. Look, if you live in the Congo, let's say, and the globalist empire wants coltan, which you in the Congo have in abundance, tantalite, and 4 million people die, this is not news anywhere. It doesn't appear in any media outlet. Control themselves as they are by eight multinationals. You remember I told you in the previous video that this type of legislation does not come from the left or the right. Forget about that. Or from any political party. Forget about that. Okay, they're all kind of more or less the same. The uni-party, people talk about it now. It means that there is something else at the top, above them, that directs and dictates. Legislation imposed from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, different agencies of the United Nations. For example, the World Health Organization is one of them. That is, I keep repeating, powers that are supranational. They were there, many of them, before with a different mission. They are still there with a different mission now. Unelected, unaccountable to anyone but themselves. How do they impose this? Well, they depend to a large extent in many cases on the weakness of independent states, independent nations. If a country is in a situation, for example, in which it needs new credit or needs to pay its immense debt or whatever it might be, and can't, many times because of internal corruption, that's true. But these supranational organizations are there to help you generously, well disposed, to renew credit in exchange for accepting what? Such and such rules that will serve their agenda. And this has now been extended internally to corporations working within your country, with the introduction of the ESG, the environmental, social, gender, whatever that quota, with that ideology. It is the same in other countries. When they need credit, well, I'm sure, Mr. President, they will say, that we could help you out with your little credit problem here and with your debt. But have you realized that how backward your country is in certain things? I mean, we are not sure whether we can trust you with giving you more credit here. Well, how do you mean backward? Well, let me see, for example, Mr. President, your country hasn't yet recognized, for example, women's reproductive health rights, has it? That's abortion. And lo and behold, you know what happens overnight sometimes? All of a sudden, from one day to the next, there are thousands of people in the streets demanding these rights, whatever that may be. No one was thinking about those things and those rights yesterday. Now the streets are full with demonstrators demanding it. Can't live without it anymore. I'm reminded here of the Brexit thing. You remember when outside Parliament, they always had the interviewers placed in one particular place, and around them there were also always these people with a European flag with the stars and so on, walking up and down, up and down, up and down. Now, some of them were very young. They were like students. Some of them were very old. These people obviously had been paid to be there, because there was they were just walking about with a flag. £10 an hour. There you go. All right. Manipulation is relatively easy. All right. Now, let me go to another point. So, national sovereignty, the sovereignty of the nation state, is threatened by the globalist agenda. But how? How did it happen? As you know, to share this with you, I normally watch several videos and read several articles in order to decide which one of them summarizes it better, so that then I can summarize it further for you. Okay, and I found one on the actual document of the Agenda 2030, the World Economic Forum. You will be, what is it? You will own nothing and be happy, kind of thing. That document. And I found it in an interview with the Chancellor of an Spanish university in Alicante, and he was giving a talk and about this agenda, this internal document. He starts, his name is Higinio Martin. I will put it down below. He's the Chancellor of a university, of a Catholic university, I believe in Alicante. Anyway, he's going to talk about this, and he starts the conference by saying, thank you very much for inviting me. I have to say that I'm just here representing myself. I have just 7 days ago been promoted from being a philosophy professor at the university to Chancellor. And so I need to say that I'm not speaking here as the Chancellor. You invited me as a philosophy professor, and I accepted as a philosophy professor of a university, and that's it. So it's going to be, he starts saying, my own personal opinion. You have asked me, he says, to read this document and what it is about. And of course, I have heard, like everybody else, about the Agenda 2030 and also all that, but I had never read the document, so I did. So he's going to summarize for the audience there, I think there were students, what the Agenda 2030 is about. This was, it was written in 2015. Now, he says if you read it, and reading it is like a penance imposed by your confessor or someone for your sins. At first, he says there is absolutely nothing unusual about it. There are 17 objectives, and within those objectives there are specified 169 goals. Okay, so the objectives from the business world is your overall long-term vision of what you want to do. I want to open a factory, a chairs factory in the UK. Okay, those are the aims and objectives and so on. Then you have the goals, which are more specific. Now you're going to specify it a little bit better. What is it and how you're going to do it? Yes? So, 17 overall objectives, and afterwards 169 specified goals. And he says at first you have a very favorable opinion. For example, long objective number 1 is to eradicate poverty in the world. You can't be against that. Objective number 2, eradicate hunger. Number 3, clean water everywhere, and then safe institutions and equitable justice, translated as social justice. We'll come back to that. Promoting equality, women's rights. Okay, all that is good. Well, yeah, you can't disagree with that. So he goes on to the 169 goals. Most of them are all right. There is actually, he says, a balance between what a reasonable person, what he calls it in Catholic parlance, a morally formed conscience, a person without prejudices of any kind. There is nothing there that you could really object to about this agenda, for the most part. You will find many things that are absolutely fine. To worry or to do something about global poverty, and they discuss it, is not something for which, you have to be given an award necessarily. It is a duty. To protect the seas, the responsibility for the environment. Okay, so everything is fine, you say that's fine. This is okay, so far so good. And then you read it all, he says, and at first glance, in the first reading, you find 3 things which are problematic and which are irreconcilable with Christian morality. Well, first of all, yes, reproductive rights and so on, you expect that. You know that they're talking about abortion. But They start by, this is what I want you to pay attention to. They start by saying that abortion should be avoided, that it is not the best answer for anything. Fine, you're reading and you say, yeah, that's right. There are other preferable forms to avoid it. You keep reading, you say, yeah, I agree with that. In other words, the exposition, the question is right. You agree with it. But it is the answer, the solution to the problem exposed that is problematic. So they, obviously to begin with, they tell you something that you're going to agree with. The response is what is problematic. And the problem is that the response is assumed throughout. Stay with me. The answer that you see for all these problems is statism. Not the state, but statism. The state is going to be the answer and give you the solutions to everything. The state will take your individual autonomy, as it were. If you read throughout, you see this. And the state will decide just about everything. That in previous decades and generations, that was very much what you yourself decided to do. And little by little, that individual autonomy, it's being taken by the state without you noticing it almost. And that seems is then you begin to see that it's everywhere in the document, this statism, the institutions of the state. And this response will be for the whole world, for all the countries of the world. And this answer is not going to be just a little problematic, just a question of nuance. If you continue reading, he says, you will soon see an asterisk there, and you go to the asterisk, and talking about reproduction rights. And it says in very diminutive, small, tiny lettering that the Holy See in Rome had some objections to this. And these objections had been provided in the Cairo Conference in 1994. So you're not going to go into looking at the Cairo Conference in 1994. You're left always with the opinion. If you disagree, for example, with this abortion thing, you're left with disagreement with the idea, with the perception that, people who disagree, their ideas were actually taken into account. They're being quite fair. It's not as if they decided to impose this on you. No. They have taken everybody's stand into account. That is the perception, the thing that you get. Okay. So some people have raised objections, and here we are telling you so. And all right. The response that they give is written in such a way that, though not forthrightly expressed, it is assumed of the whole gender ideology is assumed. And the whole gender ideology there, and this is one of the three that he refers to, is being expressed assumed in the language without any, when you talk about sex, for example, without any mention at all of biological differences. The whole, what we now see, the whole gender ideology is there assumed. Sexuality is simply expressed in terms of self-realization, self-actualization, mental well-being, health. That is, it is, in other words, without any mention of even procreation. Of course, not the family. Sex is just a question of health, self-realization, mental health issues. It is linked only to health and overall well-being. You can see how then you can introduce other things. A little less explicit than the other two is the issue of gender equality and education. Again, it is assumed, and is going to be assumed throughout, that on education, the state is the guarantor. The words equity keep coming up. Not equality, equity. Quotas. If you are old-fashioned, as I am, and I had to hire a woman simply because she is a woman, I would not tell her so. I would consider it an insult. It talks about balance and equilibrium and equity. It's in education. In the whole text, from beginning to end, what you find is this assumption, which is not up for debate, that it is the state, statism. The state is the agent of right and wrong. Religion comes as something not important. The word comes up about 3 times. And it's always together with other words that convey a negative sense. For example, discrimination. For example, domination. Always in terms of something conflictive. Something that is given to conflict, that leads to conflict. They don't put it under superstition or anything like that. It's something conflictive. And 3 times it comes up. In contrast, sport, for example, comes up always as something non-conflictive. When you read the sections on sports, well, the professor says, Professor Martin says, it reads like odes by virtue. Well, anyway, from beginning to end, you see a text that neutralizes religion, neutralizes morality. No longer moral words that we all know and recognize. They have been supplanted throughout by words such as tolerance, inclusion, diversity. No right or wrong. And even if they were there, it is clear that the judges of what is right and what is wrong in any case will be the state, the bureaucracies and the HR departments. So you have a moral neutralism here. I don't want to say neutrality. It is purposely so. It's like cutting the head off the fish, decapitating morality. It's a new morality. So they so they cut religion's head off and left you with this mush there. When it comes to the family, I won't go into it again. Of course, it is really shocking. The family we saw in the previous video, you remember, as the center of social organization throughout time, in all and in any given culture, often declared in totalitarian regimes as explicitly as the enemy. And an institution that has surprised everyone because of its endurance and survival. Well, according to the Agenda 2030, again, as with religion, always referred to in this negative sense, the family. If you read it carefully, that's what you will find. Family, the word family comes up, next to abuse, inequality, abuse of power, these conflict situations. And again, it is the state that is there to solve disputes between the family. The state is the absolute arbiter here for everything. So you have this idea at the end of reading it. You don't know quite how you got there, but you begin to see who is kind of always wearing the white hats and who are wearing the black hats. You remember in the Western movies, John Ford's shoot them up movies, the good guy always wore the white hat, and the baddie always wore the black hat. You knew from the moment that the film started who was the good guy and the bad guy. Okay, so you get this feeling of always knowing who is wearing the white hat and the black hat. And the population, the citizens are now the ones wearing the black hats. And the civil servants or the functionaries or the bureaucracy are the ones wearing always the white hats. And all those wishes and all those hopes and all those desires that you have as an individual, all those yearnings of the heart for a better life, whatever you desire for you, your family, those will be answered perhaps there at the Department of Motor Vehicles and the Ministry of Transport and the Health Department. And not only there, you see, the press occupies this terrain of jurisprudence over justice, equality, solidarity, and the brotherhood of man. And you, who might be a man, a family man, a father of children, working hard, somehow, without you noticing it, you have become really, when you read that text, you are a reactionary. You don't quite know how you became a reactionary, a danger, but you are. You were just there minding your own business, too busy to look at all these new Bible, you're a reactionary, whatever that means. Perhaps a bureaucrat at the Ministry of Transport will be able to explain it to you and will enlighten you with his light, which you haven't seen yet. But you, my friend, are now an obstacle to progress, an enemy of the environment. You are against clean water around the world. All right, so the conclusion that this Professor Martin, reaches is that when you read the whole thing, a Catholic or a Christian, or yes, cannot accept this Agenda 2030 without great reservations. Now, you are saying, okay, but you said, you're talking here about giving all the power to the states, but you were saying a minute ago that in fact the global financial oligarchy was about taking all this power from the states to themselves, or at any rate dictating, guiding the states. And you say, how are you telling us now that the Agenda 2030 gives power to the states? Okay. Well, it might all be, we're going to go back to the 1990s. Surprise, surprise. But before that, to the 1950s. Now, you're going to say, well, everything might be a coincidence. Fine. It might all be a coincidence. But you know what Roosevelt said? The first one, Roosevelt. He says, in politics, there are no coincidences. And if one exists, it has been carefully prepared beforehand. So, put the Agenda 2030 aside there for a moment, and let me tell you about something else. 1950, after the war, we have the European Convention of Human Rights. Okay? Now, let me tell you what the initial ones, because I have here from my days as a teacher, and I can read them to you. This is 1950, after the war, the abuses and so on. The main areas, these are the main areas covered by the European Convention on Human Rights, and therefore the Human Rights Act. And it was something like the Bill of Rights in America, okay? 1, the protection of property. 2, the right to life. 3, prohibition of torture. 4, prohibition of slavery and forced labor. This is after the war. 5, the right to liberty and security. 6, right to a fair trial. 7, no punishment without law. 8, right to respect for private and family life. 9, freedom of thought, conscience and religion. 10, freedom of expression. 11, freedom of assembly and association. 12, the right to marry. 13, prohibition of discrimination. 14, restrictions on political activity of aliens. 15, prohibition of abuse of rights. 16, limitations of restrictions of rights. Okay. Now, this will be amended and altered, and by 1997, it will be in different language that is going to accommodate all that we have seen in the Agenda 2030. This, let me give you a little bit of the history here, because it just seems like a little bit too outrageous to say everything. Don't want to say everything has been prepared, but the justice system had been working towards and changing with these laws on human rights, changing the language to eventually being able to accommodate the Agenda 2030 or any of the so-called woke ideology. It is actually protected because of how, all these human rights things the language had been changed. Now, after this was passed in the 1950s, it had really little impact in the UK because the country did not consider that it had any binding. It was not binding on them. All this changed because in Britain you have Parliament. Parliament is sovereign. All this changed in 1997. When the Labour Party and Tony Blair came to power, and they decided to incorporate this already changed human rights into British law. And this was done in 1998 with the passage of the Human Rights Act. It was going to incorporate all the amendments to that had been done. So the Act stated that all legislation, actions and decisions made by the government, its ministers, regional parliaments, assemblies and governments, local governments, or by any agency engaged in public business, which includes schools and the media, they all had to conform to the European Convention on Human Rights. If it did not, the courts could strike the action or legislation down if it were successfully challenged. So at first sight, the Act seems to be extremely powerful, but it contained one crucial exception. The government and Parliament itself were unwilling to set aside the principle of the sovereignty of Parliament in Britain. I'm reading you this because you will see how important it all has been. You will see where I'm getting. So they were not willing to set aside the principle of the sovereignty of Parliament. It was therefore decided that the Westminster Parliament would not be subject to the Convention by the European Union. If the government does introduce legislation that will conflict with the Convention, it must alert Parliament to the fact by making a, quote, declaration of incompatibility. In doing this, Parliament becomes aware that there is an important rights issue at stake and may wish to refuse to pass the legislation. If, however, the government can persuade Parliament that the legislation is important enough to set aside the Convention, the new law will stand. And then there was a famous There is one other safeguard